Ever since the pandemic, the specter of income inequality has been on the rise. Sometimes quietly and sneakily passed laws, and sometimes in brazen public demonstrations of record profits and tax cuts for those that need them least in society. From the US to Germany, from the pandemic to the Ukraine conflict, how exactly has social inequality developed? And how has it been allowed to reach such undemocratic heights? In this video, we'll discuss the nature of inequality today, what forces are driving it, and how a supposedly democratic system in the wealthiest nations on Earth allows for the exploitation of the poorest in society. If you enjoy what we do, then don't forget to like the video and check out our Patreon for exclusive content and early releases. Social inequality is defined as the condition of unequal access to the benefits and rights of society. This can take the form of employment, such as in France, where unemployment is 7% among ethnic French, 12% for immigrants, and 17% among those that arrived in the past 10 years. Or it can take the form of incarceration rates as a result of systemic racial discrimination, as in the US, where Black Americans represent 12% of the US adult population, but 33% of the sentenced prison population. Much more relevant to today's video, though, is income inequality. Since the 1970s, productivity per worker has grown 3.5 times as much as pay, which has remained essentially stagnant for the average employee. According to Oxfam, the earnings of the hyper-wealthy account for half of all new wealth generated in the past decade. Billionaires have seen their fortunes increase by $2.7 billion a day, while nearly 2 billion workers live in countries where a cost of living crisis is devastating entire communities as inflation continues to outpace wages. Despite half a century of neoliberal dogma claiming tax cuts for the rich means wealth will trickle down, the richest 1% captured nearly 2/3 of all new wealth, worth $42 trillion created in the past few years. This happened in the face of, and as a direct result of, skyrocketing energy and food prices, as corporate profits drove inflation. In Spain, corporate profit-seeking was responsible for over 83% of price increases. In the US, 60%, which gives the lie to the propaganda of the price-wage spiral myth. To quote Oxfam's report on international poverty, Elon Musk, one of the world's richest men, paid a true tax rate of about 3% between 2014 and 2018. Aber Christine, a flower vendor in Uganda, makes $80 a month and pays a tax rate of 40%. This is reproduced in nearly every workplace on Earth, but that doesn't get to the heart of the matter, which is, why and how can the ultra-wealthy get away with siphoning off such massive sums of money? Worldwide, only 4 cents of every tax dollar comes from taxes on wealth. Half of the world's billionaires live in countries with no inheritance tax for direct descendants. They will pass on a $5 trillion tax-free treasure chest to their children, more than the total GDP of Africa, which will ensure a future generation of aristocratic elites. Rich people's income is mostly unearned, derived from returns on their assets. Yet it is taxed on average at 18%, barely half as much as the average top tax rate on wages and salaries. Under the capitalist system, all ruling structures are built by and for capital. At every level, from political appointment to the passing of laws, the interests of the capitalist class determine what is allowed and what is not. An example of this would be the ability of half the world's billionaires to live in countries with absolutely 0% inheritance tax. This will allow up to $5 trillion of unearned wealth to flow tax-free to the next generation of the ruling class. Again, unearned, as this income is derived mostly from returns on assets. Put simply, that means having enough money to begin with to own more stuff, such as property, natural resources, factories, and so on, which will generate returns, which will in turn be reinvested into the same system. Meanwhile, regular people who work for a living are made to surrender anywhere from 20% to nearly half their pay in income taxes, as they own very little, if anything at all. This is even more egregious when polling is clear that the vast majority of people globally support raising taxes on the wealthiest in society. This is the case for the majority of the US, 80% of Indians, 85% of Brazilians, and nearly 70% of people polled in most of Africa. The primary issue here is that if it's workers generating wealth through their work, and natural resources are already there, with the necessary, usually state-funding initiated industry ready to make use of them, why are we bothering with taxing the wealthy at all? If the property is already built, usually by workers who could never afford to live there in the first place, Why are conversations always centered around minimizing the spoils of people greedily siphoning wealth from the rest of society, instead of taking away those mechanisms and using them to enrich all of society more evenly and equitably? The research is clear. The wealthiest in society are the biggest individual contributors to the climate crisis. Through their investments, they support measures that are responsible for twice as many emissions as the poorest 50% of the population. Estimates of their individual carbon footprints are nearly 30 times greater than the level agreed to in the Paris Agreement. When we're dealing with the precarity of human existence, the overburdening of the earth, the overexploitation of entire nations to support the selfish consumption of the smallest sliver of humanity, why does the conversation never go beyond the lightest slap on the wrist and a few more cents in taxes? It's because the capitalist system is designed that way. It wasn't built for you or me. It was built to maintain the economic, social, and political supremacy of capital. Throughout history, under socialist or social democratic systems, the further you went with nationalization, socialization of industry, and economic planning, the better the quality of life was for nations at equal levels of economic development. Capitalism, by its very nature, is only able to care about the accumulation of capital. And because the logic of the profit motive always leads to monopolization, that accumulation ends up in the hands of fewer and fewer oligarchs. Maybe it's time to consider what a different economic system has to offer. This episode and others like it are only possible thanks to the support of viewers like you. First Thought is 100% independent and viewer funded. So if you appreciate the work we're doing, consider supporting the show by becoming a patron on Patreon. Every patron gets early access to each episode and an audio version of the news. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.